to understand the dietary laws as best we can, and to gain from Leviticus 11 what you would have us learn and how you would have us live. We ask this, Father, for your glory and the edification of your church, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So finally, we're going to dig into actual Leviticus 11. Now, I do think when reading Leviticus that you can easily lose the forest for the trees, or as they say, you could get lost in the weeds. And that's often the case when you go to the commentaries. You find them talking about individual words, and you really, personally, I just feel like you just get down into the weeds, and you're really not hearing what the text is saying. Another thing you find in the commentaries is when they don't really understand what the passage means, they just tell it back to you in their own words. And that's real helpful, right? Real helpful. I always wanted a paraphrase of Leviticus 11. Thank you. And some of the big names, like Gordon Wenham, who's a very well-known Reformed commentator, and his commentary on Leviticus is considered one of the best. And frankly, most of the time, he's just paraphrasing what I can read in the text myself. So as we approach the actual purity laws, starting with Leviticus 11, I do want to make sure that we don't lose the forest for the trees, that we don't get into the minutia to the point where we can't grasp what this is all about. And I've already mentioned the problem with the different hermeneutical approaches, the taboo demonic approach, or the hygiene approach, or the imitation of God, or the political priesthood. All these different paradigms that groups have used to approach these purity laws to try to explain them. The problem is they can never explain all of them. So just for example, the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. So the idea being that, that man is imitating God, and that God has stipulated certain animals to be appropriate for sacrifice, and therefore they are the clean animals. Well, that's fine as far as it goes. But nowhere will you find sacrifice of an antelope. This is not there. And you're gonna be very old before you find the sacrifice of a halibut. Okay? Fish weren't sacrificed. And then of the birds, what do you find? The pigeon, the turtle dove, right? And yet, pretty much all the birds out there are clean. There's a list of about 20, 19 plus a bat. I think that's how it is. And they're not clean, and you don't eat those. But of course, you don't sacrifice those either. But all the rest of them are clean, and yet you only ever read of the sacrifice of a pigeon or a turtle dove. You don't even have them sacrificing chicken. So the point being is that none of the hermeneutical approaches is comprehensive. There's always something wrong with it. It doesn't fit the data. And you'll find as you read it that they only refer to those forbidden animals or those clean animals that do fit their paradigm. They don't ever say, well, there's an exception here because we don't sacrifice antelope, but antelope's clean. Okay? And so why don't we sacrifice antelope? Because God didn't say to sacrifice antelope, which means your whole paradigm is probably wrong. Okay? So I'm not going to approach it that way. I'm not going to try to explain why this animal is clean or unclean. I'm not going to say that, again, as we've already mentioned, that God didn't know how to teach the Israelites how to cook their pork, so they didn't get trichinosis. You know, that's the modern, very contemporary, very common view as to why pigs are unclean was because of health reasons. Same thing with shellfish. But there's no medical, and then what do we say? Okay, well, they were ignorant, right? We know now that you have to cook it at, whatever temperature, or, we know how to maintain our health while eating these foods, as if God was also ignorant and couldn't explain to them how to do the same thing. So I think pretty much all of the reasons that are given, except for one, that is separation. And I think that particular hermeneutic, the idea of separation, is already given to us. Leviticus 11, and really several of the chapters are like this. You get the reason for the chapter at the end of the chapter. Okay, but we've already seen that the prologue to the dietary laws is back in chapter 10, where Aaron, and this is the first time that we see the Lord speaking to Aaron. Then in the purity laws, 11 through 15, we have a repeating formula. The Lord also spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying. Before that, God speaking to Moses, and after that, God speaking to Moses. So that right there shows us that we're in what we would call a pericope. God is including Aaron in the conversation. And in Leviticus 10, just to remind us, the purpose of this was to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean, and so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. So the key here is to teach the distinction between the holy and the profane, and the unclean and the clean. And again, that's a chiasm. So you have in Leviticus 10:10, and there's the chiastic structure. The second pair are flipped so that you have this poetic structure. But this is the purpose for all that we're doing here in these chapters. And the application of that then takes us to passages in the New Testament where we are to be separate, come out from among them and be separate, or all who have this hope within them purifies themselves. Okay? Holiness, separateness, purification. That's all underlying the New Testament teaching. And yet these particular ordinances and these particular restrictions have been taken away. We saw that last time, where when you look at Mark 7 or Acts 10, it's quite clear, as Paul says, the kingdom of God is not a matter of food or drink. And so these things are no longer, they're no longer in force in terms of having to obey them, but that doesn't mean they're without profit in terms of teaching as to what does it mean to be separated unto the Lord? What does it mean to be a holy people living in an unholy world in the presence of a holy God? Well, that's what the church is. Okay? And not holy because of their behavior, but holy because of the sanctifying blood of Jesus Christ. And yet we still dwell as people with unclean lips among a people of unclean lips. So this whole idea of clean, unclean, I think we should recognize is a fundamental definition of what can come before God and what cannot.
What's profane mean? The definition? Just
common.
Just common.
Yes, common. Yeah, exactly. We talked about, thank you for asking, because and the same thing is true with unclean. Okay? A camel was an unclean animal, but you could ride it. You didn't have to go around killing off all the unclean animals. Okay? So it wasn't that there was something inherently evil about them either. It's just they were not acceptable for the people of God. And so profane, again, that's what's, commonly the New American Standard uses that. Quite possibly your English Bibles do the same, but the word just basically means common. as opposed to holy, which means separate or set apart. Okay? We've attributed meanings to these words, especially holy and profane. We've attributed a moral quality to these words. When, obviously holy does also have a moral quality, but its fundamental meaning in the Old Testament scriptures is set apart, dedicated, consecrated to the service of Yahweh. That's what it means. And that which wasn't consecrated was common. But you could still use that bowl or that pitcher, even though it wasn't holy, it was not something that you had to destroy. However, if something was dedicated to the Lord and then became defiled, oftentimes it did have to be destroyed. It couldn't go back to being just simply common. Okay? All right, so when we look at the fundamental idea of what we're getting into early on, hopefully that'll keep us from getting bogged down in the individual rituals, frankly, some of which we just don't know why. For example, I'm going to be hard-pressed. I keep thinking about it because I have another week, Lord willing. But why the length of the purification period for a woman is twice if she gives birth to a girl than if she gives birth to a boy? I don't know. I mean, I've read a lot of explanations, and none of them seem to make any sense to me. But we'll get into that, Lord willing, next week. But that kind of stuff, you can really get tripped up on that because it sounds like, oh, God hates women. Well, I don't know. Some women would appreciate a double break. Whether it's a boy or a girl, you either get 6 weeks maternity leave or 12. I'll take 12, thank you. That's not misogynistic necessarily. I don't think it is at all. But that's the approach that is taken in the modern air quotes, church as to Leviticus 12. But there are those types of, for example, the priest touching the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot. Yeah, got it. Okay, that makes sense to me. Well, we'll deal with that. So, frankly, what I'm saying is there are some things that I don't think we're necessarily going to be able to definitively say, this is why they did that. But I think the danger in these passages, and I see this again in the commentaries, and I think this is also a lot of reason why people don't like reading this, is because you do get down into the weeds, and it is like a bog, and it's a real hard slog to get through it. And I think the problem is that you've lost the forest, you've lost the bigger picture. So as we approach these passages, we're going to be spending more time looking at the structure of what is here than necessarily the individual parts. And to begin with, as we look at Leviticus 11, I want to read some of it. I want to read just verse 2. And ask whether this reminds you of anything. Now, I'm going to put some emphasis on the words that I'm intending should remind you of something. But he says, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth."
That sounds like instruction to Adam.
Yeah, from all the trees that are in the garden, you may eat. Right? You hear that? That's an echo, if not an allusion. But that's almost John 1:1 in the beginning. From all the animals on the earth, these you may eat. Okay. Well, that puts us in our context, doesn't it? See, our context in Leviticus 11 is Genesis 1 and 2. And really 1, 2, and 3, because that's going to carry us on to Leviticus 12, 13, 14, and 15. This is all under the paradigm of Genesis 1 through 3. Okay, so we begin with the echo of Genesis 2. Of all the trees that are in the garden, of all the animals that are on the earth. So what the purpose of Leviticus 11 is probably the same as the purpose of Genesis 2. That what we're dealing with here is a probation. Okay? So, and I do want interaction. If I say something that doesn't sound right, just jump in and say, wait a minute, okay? Because this is not, I don't know that this is self-evident until you I'm glad we did the biblical theology class, because hopefully now you're starting to hear these echoes and realize that they're probably intentional. And so what we're dealing with here, Leviticus, I'm going to say 11 through 15, but particularly 11, okay? Let me put that in there. Particularly the dietary laws. Whoops. Represent a similar probation to Genesis 2. And the situation fits, does it not? God was placing Adam in the garden, and he was placing Israel in the land. Okay? So, diagrammatically, you'd have the garden and Adam, okay? And then God says, of all the trees in the garden, of all the fruit in the garden you may eat, except one. Now we have the land and Israel, and contrary to the liberal higher critics, they're not in the land yet, right? They're stuck between Exodus 40 and Numbers 1. Remember? They're in that 30-day period. So they're not in the land yet, and they're certainly not just coming out of Babylonian exile. Okay, that's just hooey, and that's a technical term. But what he's saying is the same thing, of all the animals. Okay. Now there is a difference. The difference is that whereas in Eden, the vast majority of the trees were permissible, in the land, the vast majority of the animals will not be. Okay, so there's a difference going on here in scale, maybe in degree, not so much in kind. It is a probation. Now, of course, the other difference is that at this time, Adam had not yet fallen. Israel had. They were fallen in humanity. So there's a difference in the quality, as it were, of the two actors, but the context, the position of them is the same. They're not yet in the land, and this book is incredibly central. It's been, first of all, Leviticus is the center book of the Pentateuch. And in a very real manner, Leviticus 16, although it's not numerically the center, the Day of Atonement is the center of that book. And so if we see that kind of structure, and we see them in this, the only chronologically defined position of Israel is the book of Leviticus. Places us between two distinct passages in Exodus and Numbers for a 30-day period, 1 month. And I think that's all very significant. That Leviticus is, I won't say it's the most important book of the Pentateuch, but I would say it's the hinge book upon which everything else moves. And so I think it shouldn't surprise us that we're hearing an echo of Genesis 2, that this is a probation. And was there something inherently wrong with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Who grew it? Right? The same question can be asked of the unclean animals. Who created them? God did. So there's nothing inherently bad or evil about either the tree of the knowledge of good and evil or the unclean animals of Leviticus 11. This is a probation. God is establishing a separation to show the people that they are to be holy unto Him. And both H-O-L-Y and W-H-O-L-L-Y. Holy unto Him. As opposed to all the nations of the world, they have been brought out and put in, and here is their probation. Now, we know just as Adam failed, so also did Israel. And I mentioned this, I don't know whether it was Sunday school, but at some point we were talking about the Gadarenes. I think it was last time we were together on Thursday night. But it's always, as long as I can remember, it's always struck me as significant that there was a herd of swine just outside of Gadara in Galilee. What's that doing there? Who's got a herd of pigs in a Jewish country? Okay. Oh, it's just to feed the Gentiles, right? I got a hot dog shop downtown to feed the Gentiles. Hey, no. Okay, I think there's more to that story than just the healing of the demoniac of the Gadarenes. I think that herd of swine is indicative of the position of Israel at the end of her existence, that she was disobedient. Now, and we don't really read explicitly of the Israelites getting together on Passover and having a ham. I don't think they did that, but I think some of them probably did. There were many, and you can find that out from the rabbinic writings, but there were many who violated the dietary laws, and they did it on a regular basis, especially the Herodians. They wanted to cozy up with the Romans, and so they would eat whatever was put in front of them. And so there was a problem there, that the marker of Israel was not being observed in the time of Jesus, and I have no reason to think that it was observed consistently in the hundreds of years before Christ came. So we have a probation, and just as in the garden, we're going to have a failure. Now, I want to point out something else, and I can't do this. I don't want to read the whole passage, but I do want to just read a couple of chapters, or verses, chapters. Okay, he starts out in verse 2, from all the animals that are on the earth. Now, how do I put this up here? Okay, so I'm going to say this is an echo of Genesis 1. First, in 11 verse 2, we have the behemoth. Now, we've now adopted that word, a behemoth, being a large animal. It's basically Hebrew for a land animal. Typically four-legged, but it would also include a bear who can walk on both four legs or two legs. But it's just simply, we might say a mammal, although not entirely, because there are mammals in the sea and in the air. So, and then there's the platypus, which is its own. Okay, so, which is God saying, you're not God, are you? So the behemoth, these are, what? These are created on day 6, right? And in fact, they're basically discussed in the same manner in Genesis 1 as they are here in Leviticus 11. Then we go from there, verse 9, these you may eat, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales, those in the water, in the seas, or in the rivers, you may eat. So in 11:9, we have those that are in the water. Well, this is day 6. Okay? And then we go down to verse 11. We have, moreover, you shall detest among the birds. They are abhorrent, not to be eaten. And he goes on and gives a list of the birds. And then he adds, of course, the bat. Now, whenever this sort of thing happens, and there are several of them, the rabbit, for example, has a split hoof but does not ruminate, right? And the bat is not a bird. We know that now. Okay? Again, we have this attitude that the ancients were ignorant. The ancients calculated the circumference of the earth and aligned the Great Pyramids with the sword belt of Orion. They weren't ignorant. They built the pyramids. Mail order. All right? All the blocks were brought from Amazon, shipped in from China, and they all fit perfectly. Boy, it couldn't have been China then, of course. But I mean, they're, on the one hand, we say they must have been ignorant. They didn't know that a rabbit wasn't a ruminant, and they didn't know that a bat wasn't a bird. That's not the point. The rabbit is on the land. The bat is in the air. Again, Genesis 1 tells us that the taxonomy of Leviticus 11 is following the classification of creation day, day 6. That's why the bat's in with the birds, because it flies. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we understand the allusion here, the echo, and understand that Moses, it's all of a piece for Moses. Genesis 1 is not just his theory of how everything started. It's the underlying foundation for the whole revelation of Scripture, from start to finish. As we pointed out, Genesis 1 and 2 end up in Revelation 21 and 22. So they're bookends. So we have, starting in verse 11, the birds of the air and the bat. Again, day 6. Now, I think this also helps us understand the shift between Leviticus 11, which is talking about acceptable foods, and Leviticus 12, that begins talking about a woman after childbirth, and then we get into leprosy, and we get into all sorts of. Well, now we're at the end of day 6. We're now with man. So Leviticus 11 is dealing with all of the animal creation in relationship to man. And then Leviticus 12 through 15 is dealing with man in relationship to God.
I'm curious, when you had the echo of Genesis, it was one tree. And here you have a whole array of things that they had to go through and figure out and understand.
Yeah.
And I wonder what's significant. Something got to be significant to that. Seems like
Oh, I think it's very significant. I'm not sure I can say definitively what that significance is. Although as I said, Adam was yet in his pristine, sinless condition. The vast majority, of course, of everything that he ate was vegetable. The animal world was not available to him for food. But there is a definite shift, and I think perhaps the biggest significance is there is that shift. That whereas for Adam, everything, so Adam was at the beginning when things were still good, but now we're a way along there. And now out of so many animals, you can only eat this little bit described as I describe it. And out of all the sea creatures, you can only eat the ones that have fins and scales. So instead of a huge pot of acceptable and just one exception, now we have a huge pot of unclean and only a few clean.
I think that we can't really imagine what the world was like when Adam, before he sinned, because, I mean, if you can imagine a natural world that has no predators, that's a whole different ballgame. And so I think that has to be more detailed, because there's a lot more sin
that has affected all of creation, not just man, but also animals. And one of the things that some scholars have theorized in terms of why some things like birds are unclean is because they are predators. But even that's not really accurate, because 2 of them are not. They do not eat carrion. So there's, again, all the little excuses or explanations, there's always an exception. And that tells me we're probably not supposed to go that way. I think rather what we should see is the bigger picture. That we're hearing echoes. You know, we're hearing like Psalm 8. He has made man Lord over what? The beasts of the land and the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. That's the big picture. Is that this thing is broken out. The taxonomy of the dietary laws is, first of all, broken out along the taxonomy of Genesis 1.
Man was also meant to name them, and they are meant to distinguish them. I find a parallel between.
Oh, yes, that the man was meant to name these animals and to distinguish in that regard, and whatever the animal was, so its name was. So Adam had insight as to their nature and named them accordingly. So this is also the relationship between man and the animal world, but also we're going to see it's the relationship between Israel as Adam and the land as Eden.
I was thinking, it occurs to me that it should have been easy for Adam.
Yeah, it should have.
There's only one.
Right,
You know, you got everything else.
right.
But here it's more difficult to really be separated. It's more difficult for them. It's like,
Yeah. And yet there's a sense in which that God is making it easy here. And I'm going to, I think when we get through this, hopefully I will have explained that God is not trying to make life difficult for Israel. That which is permitted is a pretty complete diet. Okay? Now, the plant world is not included in this at all, which again kind of destroys the hygienic view, because there are far more deadly mushrooms than there are animals. Okay? So there's a lot of plants you shouldn't eat. Any of you remember Yule Gibbons? You know, that takes us back, doesn't it? But would tell us what we can and cannot eat. There's a lot of among the plants, because he was a vegetarian, but they're not even mentioned here. And I think one of the reasons they're not mentioned here is that the very eating of the animal world was something subsequent to the fall, and actually subsequent to the flood. So it places us, as you were saying, in a completely different world. And we have to acknowledge that Adam, before the fall, was in a completely different context than Israel as it's about to enter the land.
And the probation for Adam was not arbitrary. It wasn't just, okay, you can have all this, and I'm going to put this beautiful, tempting tree right in the middle, and I'm going to tell you you can't do it. And if you can pass that test, you know, we can stay in communion. I mean, it was called the tree of the knowledge of
Right.
good and evil.
Right.
So that's significant.
Very.
Exactly know how that ties to this probation. Like,
Well,
you can tie it.
It does tie in, because the whole purpose of this is to make a distinction. And Adam's distinction that he was to make was, of course, between one tree and all the rest, but it's more than that. Because as Abe was saying, that's pretty easy. You know, you just put a sign up and say, not this tree. And all the rest of them were fine, and I'm sure all the rest of them were quite delicious and quite beautiful. Okay? Why was this tree so tempting? Well, because it was an illegitimate means to a true end. And all through the scripture, God is teaching us that there is a way to truth and to joy and to peace. And it's never the way man thinks it is. It's always God's way. And so even in this, he is separating them from the nations. And in one sense, the dietary law is all about that this marks Israel. But I don't think that's the major sense. I don't think they were doing this just to be different. I think it was their daily reminder that they have been set apart by God, that they are holy to the Lord. And I think we're going to see that this extends to all of the Israelites, not just the priests. Okay? So I think there is a significance to the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. But I think, as you were saying earlier, the actual context, the historical context, is so vastly different that I do think we're somewhat limited in our ability to comprehend. And yet, I think we all see that there is a parallel here, right? That I think, and I think it's intentional. There's also the teeming things. I'll mention them because they show up kind of throughout chapter 11. The teeming or the swarming things. So when you step back and you look at the whole picture and you see how these animal groups have been set apart, there is the echo of Genesis 1. There's the echo of creation. And if you take the first, the opening of it in verse 2 and realize that this is our kind of our situation in space and time, then we realize that, the actual reason for this animal or that animal may not be inherent in the animal itself. Or it does not derive from ancient Babylonian or Egyptian taboos. See, these are all the common scholarly excuses as to why. For example, the Canaanites apparently used a pig in one of their worship rituals. I bet the guy who stumbled on that was happy. He thinks he's explained, but they don't. Others use the camel. The camel's clean, or not the camel, the cow, but the cow is clean. So there's an exception to all of these rules, and yet what is not, there's no exception to the fact that the structure is the same as Genesis 1. So that puts our mind back, just like John 1:1. That immediately takes our mind back to man as first created, and then it tells us that what we're dealing with then fundamentally, as I said earlier, is we're dealing with Israel as Adam and the land as Eden, the garden, which the Old Testament frequently refers to the land as the garden of God or some other such phrase. So this allusion is not something that we're just making up because we have the same type of wording here. It's trying to teach Israel, okay, this is who you are. Now, obviously, they're not. That's why I put it in quotation marks. Israel is not the second Adam. And yet, out of Egypt I called my son. Okay? So in a sense, Israel is Adam, the son of God. And of course, from and through Israel will come the last Adam, the Messiah, Jesus. So this is kind of looking forward to that as well. And the land was not Eden. And yet it was a land flowing with milk and honey that upon the obedience of God's people would continue to be prosperous, right? Deuteronomy, which is 28 or 29, whatever the blessings, I get them backwards. But there is now that contingency that they must obey the ordinances of God.
You put me in mind of Deuteronomy 11. It refers to the land as not like Egypt, which must be irrigated, but a land Yahweh cares for.
Yeah. That kind of language, we look at the Middle East today and I don't know, I don't really think of it as a land of flowing with milk and honey, but I don't think it's the same today as it was then either. But we do read about the land in those types of Halkaion terms, Edenic even, and yet we know it's not Eden. Man has fallen. Israel, they're sinners. Okay, they're no different than the rest of the nations. And yet God is doing something here. He's setting up a paradigm that not only takes their mind back to Eden, but also reminds them of the current disconnect between Israel and between the land and Adam as created and Eden. And that disconnect takes their mind forward to when God will bring the new heaven and the new earth, and most importantly, he will bring the last Adam, the Messiah, the seed of woman who was promised. So it's looking both backward, and that sets our context, that sets our hermeneutical paradigm in which we read these passages, but then it points forward to when this typology will become reality. because it clearly isn't. Okay? Any other questions or comments?
I was looking at Noah and the flood narrative, because clean and unclean
Yeah.
animals are already made a distinction there.
Yep.
But after the flood, God uses similar language of what they may eat, but it's everything. I give you all the animals.
Right. Yep, that's exactly where we're headed next. Because this is not just creation. This also, and this may help us understand the differential between the many acceptable trees and the one forbidden one, and now the many forbidden animals and the few acceptable ones. There is that transition, but now we have an echo of the flood. It's not nearly as clear in the language of Leviticus 11, except that it uses the terminology of clean and unclean in terms of animals. And we generally think, well, that's where the clean and unclean come from. But in Genesis 7, Noah is instructed that of the clean animals, and that's exactly the terminology, he is to take 7 pair. And he is to take 2 pair of unclean. And again, the same word, clean and unclean. And to give a little bit of credence to the idea of the sacrificial being the clean and then therefore acceptable to eat, in Genesis 8, verse 20, Noah sacrifices from the clean. So this is all already there, which I always find intriguing. There's obviously, well, I say obviously, there seems to have been some communication by God that has not been recorded.
But no priesthood.
There's no priesthood. Noah's the priest. Yeah, Noah would be the priest because he's the one offering up the sacrifice. As Abraham would be a priest, or as Adam would have been a priest. And even the judgment between Cain's sacrifice versus Abel's, we look at that as, and people have said, God is so arbitrary. He just decided he has favorites. He decided he liked Abel more than he liked Cain. No, that's not God. It is quite clear, though it may not be clear in the text, but it has to be clear in the nature of God, that Cain was not following some proper procedure. I think, frankly, he was offering a peace offering and not a burnt offering. He was not acknowledging his sin, and yet he wanted to acknowledge his communion with God. And it's like, no, you can't do that. I don't know that because the text doesn't say that. I'm reading into it. But then even those sacrifices are mentioned in the pre-Mosaic chronology. So this is somehow already ingrained in the human mind. Whether it's explicit, which it very well may have been, or whether it's implicit in the very nature of God. I think it's explicit when Noah is told 7 of the clean animals, 2 of the unclean, and yet he's not told which are which, as we are in Leviticus.
Before I forget, I think this is jumping ahead, but Cain offering a peace offering and not acknowledging his sin and then being cast out. In Leviticus, we have the man who does not acknowledge his sin. Is he not then cast out?
He is cast out. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And if you didn't do this, and we're going to find out it's more explicit in Numbers 5, but if a man refuses, for example, to be purified when he has been defiled, he is then cut off from his people and cast out. So this is serious stuff if it's followed, okay, if it's actually obeyed. And as Abigail was mentioning, and I don't know exactly, I think it's in Genesis 9, but we have basically meat is permitted without restriction. Okay. This represents now the way of the world. Fallen man, the sin of Adam has passed through the flood. The flood did not wash away the corruption of Adam's fall. And it is still innate in Noah and his sons and his descendants. And now this is the world. We have the table of nations, and from that world, God will call Abraham. But no such restriction on Abraham's diet is in the text. He's still part of the nations. It isn't until Sinai, it isn't until the wilderness that God makes a specific distinction between one nation and all the rest. Okay? So we're moving in progressive revelation of salvation history. We go from an entirely vegetarian diet with one restriction to really a completely carnivorous diet. I mean, obviously they could still eat fruit and vegetables, but there's no restriction on what Noah and his descendants are allowed to eat among the animal world. God has given them into his hand. So again, that argues against the hygienic view, right? I mean, Abraham could have had pork and sauerkraut for Christmas. It would not have been forbidden to him to do so. So what's wrong with that picture? He's before Israel, right? So if Israel doesn't know how to cook a pig, how did Abraham know how to do it? Again, these are the arguments against the common understanding of the dietary laws that just really they don't hold water. They don't work. There's got to be something else going on here. And I think fundamentally what's going on here is the distinction. God has already made a distinction in saving Noah and his sons, the 8 souls that were saved in the ark. Now it's kind of, okay, repopulate the earth, and not only the plants do I give you, but all the animals. So whatever you want to eat, you can eat. Without incurring guilt. You might still incur trichinosis. Or gallbladder, or appendicitis. Go ahead.
Do you think, I'm confused. So we were assuming that the clean and unclean animals was not just for sacrifices, or was it for food? I mean, he was telling, so you think they had a code before Moses that was to tell them what to eat? Or was it just...
Oh, no, yeah, just at this point, one definition of clean, if we use the Noahic example, was that only the clean animals are acceptable for sacrifice.
That's not a prohibition on
That's not a prohibition because, as I said, Noah was allowed to eat any of them. There's no prohibition on eating. There are no dietary.
That's not like lifting restrictions here. He's not lifting restrictions.
No. There were no restrictions, and yet there was a knowledge of a distinction between clean and unclean. Right. That's the mystery. That's the intriguing part. That, it was okay for Noah, and then by implication Abraham and Isaac, it was okay for them, and Jacob, by the way, to eat an unclean animal and not incur uncleanness or guilt. Now, one of the things that we've already seen in the early chapters of Leviticus is that, going back to this same kind of image, God walked with Adam in the garden, right? And God dwelt with Israel in the tabernacle. So one of the fundamental truths that lies behind all of what we're reading is the imminent presence of God with his people. Okay? During the period between Noah and Sinai, God was not dwelling in the midst of his people. Acts 14 Paul talks about God basically leaving the nations to their own paths during this time. He's not dealing with the rest of the nations. He's not even dealing with Israel yet.
But he's always dealt with his, for lack of a better word, remnant. He's always had a line. He's always had from Seth to, you mentioned Spirit was infused into them what to do and what to say without really knowing them. It's almost, it seems to me it's almost like sometimes somebody would say something about an interpretation of the scripture, and somehow I know this ain't right. It's like.
Well, I think that there's clearly evidence of God communing with individuals. He walked with Enoch, and Enoch walked with God and was no more, right? I think there had to be some understanding that Cain and Abel had that Cain rejected, that may have come through Adam. I mean, these things aren't recorded, and I don't think we have to conclude that they just made them up as they went along. And that's, again, the liberal view is that they just kind of made these things up as they went along. I don't think so. We know that he talked with Abraham, and that he wasn't even going to bring judgment down upon Sodom and Gomorrah without first talking to Abraham, because he had called Abraham in order that Abraham would teach his children and his grandchildren. So, yes, you're absolutely right. He had a remnant, or at least a line, that stretches from Seth all the way to Jesus. But we have something new here, because we have a people, and we have a territory, and we have God dwelling in that, with that people in that territory. Okay? We have a people, Adam and Eve. We have a territory, the Garden of Eden, and we have God dwelling with man in that garden. Same thing here. Okay? So part of the application of all of this is to transpose these environments to the new creation and the new creation people, the church. Okay, so what do we have? Let's I'm jumping ahead, but let's do this now. Well, let me not put it that way. Can we say that God is dwelling in the midst of this people? Can we say that God is dwelling in the midst of the new covenant, new creation people?
Yes.
It's the Holy Spirit, isn't it? Okay? Justin.
Am I thinking about this wrong? So my mind always goes to this idea of intentionality. So in my mind, obviously it's all very intentional in God's sovereignty and the way He did something, and then what was recorded for us. And so where my mind goes is trying to track that line of, I have these two people, they couldn't do it. I wiped everybody out with a flood to start over, they still couldn't do it. I separated people and gave them rules to follow, and sin abounded because of the law. They still couldn't do it. Christ came, did these things. I was able to dwell amongst them because of what, right? It's not arbitrary that Christ came in history when He came. There was a demonstration of why, not only His glory and how perfect and awesome God is in those things, but we have this track record that you can look at and say, that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, the only...
These rules were given to show that you still couldn't do it. Like that's
In a sense, that's very true, but in another sense, it moves along the line of dispensationalism, which I know you're not doing that, but I appreciate what you're saying, because it will allow me to try to connect these in the ways that they are commonly connected or commonly disconnected. The dispensational view is, there was this, that didn't work. Then there was this, that didn't work. Okay? And what about the future? Well, this ain't going to work either. We're already told that, right? Okay? Even Jesus Himself is going to get trapped in Jerusalem by the armies of Gog and Magog. That always struck me as weird. That the risen Lord of glory,
What are you talking about?
dispensationalism.
They say that?
Yes. Oh yeah, and in Armageddon, he's actually trapped, and it'll have to be God Himself, kind of like the Marvel movie when, never mind, I won't go there. I mean, it's pretty bad stuff. It really is. When you get into it and read what they say about how the things are going to turn out, they really verge on blasphemy.
Right, because Paul says that the
Yeah, tear down, yes, right, that's not dispensationalism. But if you, and I'm not suggesting that you do, but if you read into dispensation, you would be shocked at what you're actually reading. Okay, you really would.
Jews a different way.
It will save them a different way. But as I said, at Armageddon, Jesus is actually surrounded by the armies of Gog and Magog, and God has to come rescue him. Like, wait a minute. This is the Lord of glory. All authority in heaven and earth has been given unto him. I don't think so. But this is the problem. But as you know, what the truth is this. Okay? Now, what this tells us also in application is that we occupy an analogous position in God's redemptive history to the position that Israel occupied. Only we're not localized, nor is God. In other words, he's not only in the tabernacle or later in the temple. In fact, he never came to the second temple, and the Jews knew it. They were aware that the Shekinah had never descended upon the second temple. So the context, when we read the Old Testament, what we should be thinking of is we are the next step, huge step, in what Israel was.
There also seems to be a widening of scope, both of the amount of land and the amount of people in each of those.
Yes, it's getting larger and larger until it becomes the consummation, which is the new heaven and the new earth, where righteousness dwells.
I don't see it as like dispensationalist linear timeline, but as like non-Newtonian Russian nesting dolls.
Okay. you would see it that way. Non-Newtonian Russian nesting dolls. All right.
Completely cut off from each other.
Right.
They do bleed into each other.
Yeah, but they are distinct.
They are distinct.
Yeah.
But they
And they are, in a sense, concentric.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. Yeah, see, okay. Yes, it makes sense. Okay.
Well, I mean, the periods of distinction give some credence to why people arrive at this idea of dispensation. It doesn't mean that they're correct in their assumptions. You can clearly see the progression of happen because we are beings of time, those things through time. That doesn't. God's intention was the same from the beginning. So
That's exactly the intentionality, and that's what I was going to finish up with. Is you're absolutely right about the intentionality. The error of dispensationalism is to say that God's intentionality ever either failed or changed. It has always been his intention to do these things. What matters for us is to recognize this connection right here, that this is who we are, which is analogous to who they were, which was analogous to who Adam was. And so though we don't have these restrictions, we still have the demands of cleanness and uncleanness. We have purity and impurity. We have holy and profane, because Paul says, come out from among them and be separate. Touch no unclean thing, he says, and yet he knows now that all foods have been declared clean. So obviously he's referring to this whole paradigm, but under a completely different regime.
It also seems similar to how Paul is going to call back to the fact that God makes a covenant with Abraham before he's circumcised. And this
Right.
goes to, he gave Noah all of the animals before the distinction.
Yeah, and even, thank you, yes, God called Abraham and made the covenant before circumcision. Paul points that out. He has the clean and unclean with Noah, though there's no restriction on Noah's diet. So the facts are there. And I think that also plays into something I mentioned before, and that is the people were already clean. All of what we're reading in Leviticus 11 through 15 are exceptions to the normal condition. Now, we haven't really gotten into the personal uncleanness, but they were exceptions to the normal daily life. They were not things that they had to do to get clean. They were things that made them unclean, which implies, of course, that they were first clean, and then the steps needed to get back to being clean. That was their normal condition, which is really, a lot of people misunderstand that. They think that all of this is about how to please God, how Israel tried to get themselves saved, how to go to heaven when they died. That's how we see it. No, it's as Jesus said to the disciples, you are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. One commentator says this, it is important to understand, moreover, it's the same author, okay? She was talking about an author that uses the word moreover. There aren't many that do that. It is important to understand, moreover, that while for Israel the status of clean was the normal state, yet this status was never to be taken for granted as an ethnic right or otherwise. Rather, it was the direct result of Israel's divine redemption and consecration. They were made clean by their deliverance through the Exodus. They were cleansed by the mighty act of God's redemption, God's calling them. He didn't call them to then become clean. It's His calling that makes them clean. And that's the same. Adam was unfallen. He was clean. Israel was called, elected. It was clean. So are we. We are regenerate. Therefore, we are already not only justified, Paul said, but sanctified in Jesus Christ. And yet, as with Israel, our continued cleanness is not something to be taken for granted. That, as James says, true religion is it James or is that John? Okay, I get him. James, thank you. Okay. Oof, I just taught on it. But all of a sudden, I just had this little stray thought that said, that's not James. Get off me. But he says, this is true religion, right? Visiting widows and orphans in their distress and what? Keeping oneself unstained from the world.
I was thinking that, it reminds me then, it was something always puzzled me, that if he touches a dead body, he would become unclean. So that must mean he was clean before.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Unclean afterwards, or they do something. So
Yeah, and corpse uncleanness is the most severe. And so severe that the high priest cannot go near a corpse even of his father or his mother, nor can the Nazirite. I mean, when you mention corpse uncleanness, you're now at the very heart. We're going to get there, but you're now at the very heart of this paradigm of clean and unclean, which tells us that we're also dealing with another paradigm, and that is life and death. That behind all of this, and you mentioned this back when we were talking about, but the dichotomy of life and death is just major overtones here. But that's going to come out even more. I mean, it kind of comes out, and scholars want to try to bring it out, especially with the birds of prey. But I think they're stretching it a little bit too far there. But when you get to corpse uncleanness, okay, it's going to come out in the law of leprosy, for example. So the idea of life and death is really behind all of this. In some places much more explicit than others, but it's one of the governing backdrop, the backstory of all that we're talking about. And that's really all of this. In the day that you eat, dying, you shall die. Okay? If you will not be cleansed, you will be cut off and be as dead. Okay? So now there's a little difference here, of course, because that death has been taken on the Messiah and borne all the way through to victory. But nonetheless, there is still the whole clean and unclean, pure and impure, holy and profane. We are not profane. We are not common people. I mean, the church has occasionally caught sight of that. And when it does, there's been times of revival because it's an incredible thought. It's an incredible concept. It's not a prideful concept because it's only by the grace of God that Israel is chosen. It's only by the grace of God that we are regenerate. But being regenerate means we're not common folk. This is one of the things that politically, historically, destroyed the entire regime, pardon the pun, of monarchy. The whole ancien regime, I think, was ultimately destroyed by Protestant Christianity. The realization that every one of us is a priest to our God, and a royal priest at that. Which means slowly over the centuries, people started to ask the question, by what right do you rule over us? And I refer you to Monty Python for the answer to that. Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's an episode there, will explain how they had no right to rule over. But fundamentally, it doesn't mean we don't have government and don't submit to government, but what it does mean is we're not of this world. Our citizenship is from heaven, and we're not common people. We're holy people. And as we get into chapters 12 through 15, we're going to see, as with the Nazarite, so also with every Israelite, and that is they couldn't just simply foist holiness off on the priesthood. Okay, you be our holy people. We'll just be regular people. No.
I was going to say that's the Declaration, inalienable rights endowed by a creator. But I mean, isn't that the same idea?
It is very much the same idea. Sadly, the Enlightenment writers behind that, and that's actually not original to Jefferson. I think it may have been original to John Milton, that phrase. But he borrowed it, and nobody seemed to bother with the copyright. He gets credit for it, but it wasn't actually his. Pardon me?
The copyright was in England.
It was in England, right? And we were rebelling with that anyhow. We scoff at your copyright laws. But the problem was the Enlightenment wanted to remove God from that whole. Okay? So especially Jefferson, when he talked about inalienable rights granted by our Creator, he was not along the same lines in his theorizing, but I think it was from the same source. Okay, if we look at the history of thought in the modern era, pre-modern, early modern, and current era, we can see that during what was called the Renaissance, there was somewhat of a scholastic move back to the original sources, including the Greek and in some places even the Hebrew of the Bible. That path was bifurcated. It went through the Reformation, and then it split between Enlightenment and evangelicalism. And much of what we think today has been influenced by that path called the Enlightenment, which relied on an inner light in man, that our inalienable rights are innate, not actually given. We forfeited those inalienable rights. That's where they don't go, is that we forfeited those inalienable rights back here. I would argue that we don't have, in the human fallen world, any inalienable rights because we forfeited them. We regain them in Christ. But even then, we don't have them in a political sense. I know that sounds controversial, but if you have an inalienable right, it means it cannot be taken away. That's what inalienable means. You cannot be separated from it. History is actually quite full of men being separated from those rights. Does that make sense? They are gifts for which we should be incredibly thankful. They are privileges for which we should be, what's the word? Diligent. But I don't know that I would agree with the phrase inalienable in a fallen world. Okay. That's a different subject. Probably said enough already. So let's move back to the dietary laws as we're kind of running out of time. All right, so I've already reviewed some of the hermeneutics that are approaching, the way approach to these, and I want to say that the only one that I think is valid, the only one that is consistent, is the idea of separation. That what God is doing here, he summarizes at the end of the chapter, and I'm going to read the whole section from verse 44. For I am the Lord your God, Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt. There's that cleansing. There's that deliverance. Throughout the Pentateuch, you hear, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Those are two sides of the same redemptive coin. Okay? So he says, I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is the law regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth. There's that Genesis 1 again, and Psalm 8. To make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. And as we've seen with Noah, that second one, the edible versus the inedible, that's new. That's the new thing here. And it's new so that Israel, several times a day, I don't know how many meals they normally ate during the day, but for us it might be 3 times a day, you would be reminded by your diet that you are the called out people of God. And you would announce your consecration by refusing to eat from any unclean plate. Okay? So there's that separation. I think that's really fundamentally the paradigm that goes over all of these dietary laws, and it's the idea of a separated people. Be holy because I, the Lord your God, is holy. Now, throughout the rest of the Old Testament, God is going to make a point, many places, especially in the prophets, that he's not like the other gods. He's already done this in Egypt, hasn't he? He took on the Egyptian gods and their magicians, and he whooped their butts. Okay? He bared his arm in salvation and humiliated the gods of Egypt, which were the most powerful in the world at the time. So he scoffs at the idea of these false gods and these idols. But he is a unique God. This is essentially a monotheistic concept that we're reading in these verses. And because he is separate from among the gods, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? What's the answer? None. No one. Paul goes on to say that we know that there are no other gods. There are no idols. Okay? So he's saying, I am holy. We tend to think, well, that means he's perfect and he doesn't sin. Well, yes, that's true, but that's not really the point. The point is he is uniquely separate. Or as Karl Barth used to say, he was wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, other. He is wholly other from all other things. And that's what he's calling his people to be within their realm, and that is humanity. He's calling Israel to be wholly other. And this is how it will manifest itself day by day. Now again, I think that concept, hopefully, will help us better understand the nature of the distinctions. Okay, so we're going to look at why certain animals are declared clean and others unclean. And we're just going to look at these in the order of their presentation. First, the behemoth, the beasts of the field. That's kind of a literal translation. It's kind of hard to envision a lamb as a beast, but that's the word behemoth. What is it about them that distinguishes them from all others? Well, they split the hoof and they chew the cud. Now, I mentioned earlier, several weeks ago, some of the ideas that go behind this, and it's somewhat amazing the level of scholarship that is dedicated to some of these views. Mary Douglas, for example, believed that this was all dealing with the normal locomotion of the animals. So, for example, birds are supposed to flap their wings. But the birds that are prohibited don't. They flap and then they soar. Well, I don't know what you do about the bat. But see, the bat is erratic. And see, that's also abnormal. So animals that are erratic, okay, they swarm. That's the word. They swarm. And bats do. But so do swallows, I think. I don't know how on earth you can get a photo of a swallow. So the idea was that the split hoof somehow made the animal's traction more stable. Except that in the Middle East, the two animals that were used for warfare were the horse and the camel. The horse has a solid or a contiguous hoof, and the camel has like a hoof paw, or a paw hoof, a poof. It doesn't have a hoof and it doesn't have a paw, but it doesn't have a split hoof. And yet these are war animals. And you would think that stability of traction would be pretty important for a war horse or a war animal, okay? So again, you'd think this, okay, you really think that. Why do you think that? Because it's not actually the reason.
I have been kind of wondering as you've been talking about this. I realize there's not apparently a grand unified theory of unclean animals. However, there are groupings of them that have interest to the Commonwealth of Israel, either religious interest or cleanliness interest, association with blood, or with refuse, bottom feeders, that sort of thing. I mean, is it possible that it is a combination of things that go into this?
I don't think so. And is there a combination of these things? You're going to find elements of different justification in this or that. But a catfish has fins and scales and is a bottom dweller. A rather dirty fish, actually. So what I'm saying is that every one, I can point out an exception. I might not be able to do it off the cuff, but in each one you can find an exception to the rule. And there are no exceptions here. Catfish were clean, but they weren't. There are other animals that do feed on carrion, if they have to, that were clean. Fish as well. Fish will eat dead. They will eat sea carrion, basically, if that's what's there. So, I guess what I'm going to say put it this way, is there's a plausibility in every one of those hermeneutical methods. But within that plausibility, there is a susceptibility to inconsistency and to exceptions. And I feel like that's duct tape. I feel like if there's an exception, then you have to somehow, and this is what the rabbis did, you have to come up with another set of rules to account for and deal with that exception. I'd rather there not be any exceptions. Okay? Does that make sense?
It makes partial sense. I may state a principled disagreement with the sense it makes.
Oh, that's fine.
The law.
Yeah, fortunately, none of this matters because we can have
It matters a lot.
whatever you had for dinner or whatever you yet to have for dinner is okay. But it matters. I mean, it doesn't matter in the critical sense that it would have in Israel under this law. Okay. My approach, I think it may be a difference in hermeneutics, and it may even be a difference in how you orchestrate your own diet. I don't know. I mean, that's a principle that I think Romans 14 then addresses. Abe.
I think most of these things, and we've talked about these I think before, different things about different understanding of when books was written, who wrote them, and all these things, is trying to classify God in a certain way, under human understanding. Surely he was thinking of this, and this is the reason because we're trying to bring God in our minds, and that's impossible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that is very much a temptation, and sometimes I think it's almost unavoidable. And I also think that in that, we are often directed by those thoughts or those paradigms, those thought patterns that are ours, that are of significance to us. I think that in some, for example, in some cases, the hygienic view will be of more influence. For an anthropologist studying the ancient cultures of Babylon and Sumeria, and the idea of taboo and demonic influence will be very powerful in their thinking. And it comes out, even though there's absolutely nothing about the demonic in this text at all. Okay? There's absolutely nothing about any of these unclean animals representing demons. In fact, there's absolutely nothing about demons in the whole thing.
I think you're arguing for consistency, though, and I don't know, he wasn't consistent when he wrote or put the bat in with the birds.
Oh no, I think he was on two.
What about the next section, insects that have 4 feet?
Yeah, I think that's also, well, no, that's fine. That's actually, I put that in the notes. That's actually an idiom. That's simply, it was not, I mean.
Well, the idiom, it comes, though, when it says walk on all fours.
That's
but
it, yeah.
The last part of that section, it says insects that have 4 feet.
Right, but
Which is a little bit more clear.
no, it's the same. No, it's the same idiom. It's just translated differently for some reason. And what it means is walks on the ground. Walks on the ground. I mean, again, we should not assume that the ancients couldn't count. That if they looked at a spider, that they couldn't figure out it had 8 legs. Or if they looked at an ant, that it had 6. Right? Again, I don't think we should. I think that that's a danger of contemporary thinking that we often do when we look back. Oh, they just didn't understand. That's one of the reasons why we have such a struggle among the sexes with biblical teaching, is because we assume that Paul lived in a patriarchal, misogynist culture, and therefore he wrote these things. But we know better now. I think the error is the first assumption, that the ancients they didn't know that insects had more than 4 legs. No, it's actually a phrase. And it would be better if it had been translated that crawl on the ground, because the distinction that the law makes is that the clean insects hop. Okay? So, I mean, that's what I'm trying to show. And I'm not saying that this is definitive and that none of the other things had anything to do with it. I think that's what you were saying. Could there be a combination? All I'm saying is I don't see where those types of nuances were either presented to Israel or shed light on this. I think what I'm trying to present to you is both a consistent and unnuanced view. Okay? And I'm going to take them out of order. Fish had to have fins and scales. Insects had to have jointed legs and hop. And actually the joint had to be higher. The middle joint had to be higher than the body joint. Okay? Birds. Well, birds have feathers and beaks, but they all do. In fact, it's very hard to distinguish a bodily characteristic of a bird that isn't the same bodily characteristic of the other birds. Now, the inconsistency seems to be in the bat, but it isn't, because the bat is a creature of the air, which takes us back to his fundamental classification. Okay? That's why the bat's there. I don't know that they knew that the bat was, what is a bat? A rodent? A mammal? It's a mammal. I know it's not a bird, and it's not a reptile, at least not anymore. Sorry. I know, but gotta laugh. Notice the pattern here. Each of these groups has two distinctions that are eminently visible. Right? Even the rabbit and the rock badger look like they're chewing the cud, though they're not. They go like this. Okay? they chew like they were chewing cud. Okay. Now I don't know what they did in terms of animal surgery or any of that anatomy stuff, but they didn't have to, because when you killed an animal, you gutted it, right? It wouldn't take long to realize that some animals have more stomachs than others, and that the rabbit doesn't have as many stomachs as the cow. I don't know that they would put it all together and realize that that's what chewing the cud was. I think they probably could have done that. But my point is, I don't think that's the point here. I think the point here is that with the three that do have visible common characteristics that distinguish them from other members of that classification, here they are, and you can see it. If it looks like it's chewing the cud, it's okay. But what's wrong with the rabbit? No split hoof. Well, that's not hard to find out either. Okay? So this is incredibly visible. And then we get to the one classification that isn't, and that's the birds. So we're just simply given a list. Okay? We're just given a list.
In many aspects of this stage of God's people's development, the visible characteristic was what distinguished them from the people around them.
Yes, circumcision was one of them, although it wasn't, visible in the sense of an animal being chewing its cud or having a split hoof. But it was a bodily distinction. But also the Sabbath was visible. They did not work, their servants did not work, their cattle did not work on the Sabbath. Okay? These were things, but I guess what I'm saying is that we're kind of complicating matters when we look at all these other possible reasons, and we can easily fall into that modern arrogance of thinking that the ancients were ignorant, and we should never do that, whether in any form of history. I don't think, if we believe that man is created in the image of God, then we cannot believe that he was ever more ignorant than he is now. Does that make sense? And there are many things that would point out that we are perhaps more ignorant than we once were. So I think it's always a bad, whether you're reading history or whatever it may be, political theory, it's always a bad move to think that you know better than a previous generation. That's not a firm foundation to work from, especially when you realize what the ancients did do.
I think we want to know that God is not arbitrary, though, and that he is not just putting arbitrary restrictions on people. We want to give a meaning to all of
I think you're right. But I think we would do better to just simply get away from the word arbitrary, but also to realize that the secret things belong to God. He may have a reason for the distinction that he's made, but what we can see is that these were not, those explanations were not given. We're not told why the split hoof and the ruminating. Okay, we're not told why, but the one thing that I can come to that applies to all of them consistently is that these distinctions were readily visible. And where you did not have a visible distinction, an easy, ready definition between one member of the class or the genus and the others, he simply gave them a list and said, these 19 in the bat you don't eat. Okay? Again, there may be other reasons in there, but those reasons aren't given. And so whenever we're looking for something that isn't given, we're entering into the realm of conjecture. And I'd rather not go there, personally. I don't think we have to. So in a sense, from our perspective, these are arbitrary. But they're not arbitrary for two reasons. One, there was the intentionality of making Israel different from the nations and making Israel know that it was different. That's really the key. Not that others would look at them and say, oh, they're different, but rather they would look at themselves and say, we are different. We are holy unto Yahweh. Okay? And then the second thing is, there's a lot of grace here. They didn't really have a hard time figuring this out. Lift the hoof, watch it eat, okay, put it on the plate. Okay? I mean, it's same with the, pull it out of the water, fins, scales, put it on the plate. Right? and even the insects, it's pretty easy to tell a grasshopper. I have a hard time differentiating beetles. Okay? A lot of them look very similar. Well, you didn't have to worry about that. It didn't have a jointed leg where the middle joint was higher than the body joint. But locust, the grasshopper, I mean, you just look at them and there they are. I don't know, does the katydid have well, that would have been clean? Huh? Katydid? Okay, I was thinking that. I didn't go anywhere with it. But, but do you see my point? That we can simplify this and we can make this consistent, that God is creating a distinction first of a people. And now he's inculcating into that people the nature of their distinctiveness. And then he's going to continue with chapter 12 and on. And this kind of all culminates as a crescendo in chapter 16 with the Day of Atonement. Well, let's close in prayer. Father, again, we thank you for your word, and we do admit that we see as in a mirror dimly. And we ask that you would keep us humble, help us to read your word with faith, reading it as understanding that these things have been finished in Jesus Christ, and yet they still have the power to instruct and to guide and even to reprove. So give us understanding, we ask. We ask for our growth in grace and in the knowledge of who you are and what you have done for us. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.